Honourable Member for Halliburton, Guarda Lakes, Brock.
Thank you very much, Speaker. I rise in the House to speak to yet another attempt by this Liberal government to curtail the rights of Parliament. Motion 22 includes a proposal to give the Liberals new power to extend sitting hours in the House through June 2023 to temporarily remove certain procedural tools from the opposition, and for the Prime Minister to adjourn the House early at Christmas and in June without notice or all-party agreement, among other changes. A few years ago, Speaker, I stood in this chamber and spoke to the government's attempt, then, Motion 18, to reduce the opportunity for members to hold the government to account by eliminating Friday sittings, automatically time allocating bills, and to eliminate the effectiveness of committees through preventing opposition parties from triggering debates on reports and implementing closure changes to committee. That was back in the spring of 2017, when they were awarded a majority Parliament on the promises of sunnier ways. After 5 years of failed Liberal leadership, they're back at it, this time under a minority government and with the help of their NDP partners. Make no mistake, even after Canadians punished the Liberals with a minority mandate, they still want to rule like they have a majority, completely disregarding the role of opposition and punishing this side of the House when we dare question their record. Committees play an important role in our democracy. It invests parliamentarians with the responsibility to examine legislation, undertake studies on departmental spending, and to hold the government to account for its actions. And I think this is really where the problem lies. Whether it's SNC-Lavalin, the WE scandal, trips to the Aga Khan's village in the tropics, $54 million to arrive can, that scandal, or the use of the Emergencies Act. The Liberals just don't want Canadians digging into their business. Canadians might be wondering what my words here have to do with Motion 22. Well, it's simple. Every time the House sits longer, which the Liberals have the power to do unobstructed by parliamentary tradition and rules, committees get cancelled. And just this morning, Speaker, the Auditor General released a damning report outlining the complete failure at Indigenous Services Canada, and to quote, to provide the support First Nations communities needed to manage emergencies such as floods and wildfires, which are happening more often and with greater intensity, end quote. Finding that, quoting again, the department's actions were more reactive than proactive, despite First Nations communities identifying many infrastructure projects to mitigate the impact of those emergencies. The department actually had a backlog of 112 of those infrastructure projects that communities themselves have identified were eligible, but the department had not funded. The department is also spending 3.5 times more money on responding to and recovering from emergencies such as floods than it would if they actually funded those communities to prepare and mitigate those effects. 3.5 times more. Unbelievable. The revelations, Speaker, of the Auditor General uncovered exactly the kind of things committees need to dig into. And it's exactly those kinds of things that this government is trying to avoid answering questions on. Questions like, why did they provide funding for approximately 190 full-time or part-time emergency management coordinators without any clue whether that was enough capacity to manage those emergencies? Or why high-risk First Nations communities were ignored and not prioritized for resources? Or how Indigenous Services Canada failed to address issues identified after evacuations, like, quote, improving access to essential services like mental health supports and health care. The department also did not integrate the impact on marginalized groups, including Indigenous elders, women and youth, into how emergency services were planned and delivered on First Nations communities, end quote. Or perhaps it's bad enough, but perhaps most damning, Speaker, is why Indigenous Services Canada officials simply passed the buck and blamed First Nations for their problems in the name of self-governance. The Auditor General found that Indigenous Services Canada did not use information about the risks faced by First Nations and the capacity of First Nations to respond to those emergencies. I quote, "The Department provides funding for First Nations communities to develop community vulnerability assessments and emergency management plans. These assessments and plans are important because they help First Nations prepare and mitigate for emergencies by identifying risks and outlining how they will be managed. Departmental officials told the Auditor General that, in the spirit of supporting First Nations self-governance, they did not require First Nations to provide this information to the department," end quote. How the heck can the minister find this acceptable? According to the government's own 2019 Emergency Management Strategy for Canada, every $1 invested in preparedness and mitigation, $6 can be saved in emergency response and recovery costs. Yet Indigenous Services Canada, their total spending on response and recovery activities, $646 million. That was 3.5 times more than its spending on preparedness and mitigation activities at $182 million. This is yet another example of the Liberal government's complete disregard for Indigenous people and their complete disregard for managing taxpayers' money. In Budget 2019, Indigenous Services Canada was allocated approximately $1.4 million over 3 years to support First Nations-led management and engagement on multilateral emergency management service agreements between Indigenous Services Canada, First Nations communities, and provinces or other service providers. Unsurprisingly, the Auditor General found that as of April 2022, although the department had spent almost $790,000, they found that no multilateral agreements were established. Half the money gone, nothing to show for it. It really is unbelievable, Speaker. It was exactly 6 months ago when another parliamentary officer released a report on the mismanagement at Indigenous Services Canada. This time, it was the Parliamentary Budget Officer. That was in May. The Parliamentary Budget Officer's report detailed the Liberals' continued approach of pumping more money into a broken Ottawa knows-best system that failed Indigenous people. Rather than working with Indigenous leaders to eliminate the inequalities, the inherent, just baked into the bureaucracy, barriers that are holding Indigenous people back from achieving prosperity, this government keeps on pushing its failed policies over and over again. The Parliamentary Budget Officer report found that instead of fixing the problem, the Liberals blew through their budget by $863 million, a 48% increase, which only resulted in, quote, a significant decline in Indigenous Services Canada's ability to actually get the job done. Spend more, Speaker, achieve less. This is yet another example of a report that may never see the inside of a committee room if Motion 22 passes. The Liberals promise the world, Speaker. Then they completely fail to deliver. Again, it's unbelievable, Speaker. Even more unbelievable is that Motion 22 will pass with the support, probably, of their NDP buddies. The New Democrats have said many times that they are committed to undertaking the work of reconciliation in good faith and in true and equal partnership with Indigenous communities across the country. They say they are ready to make investments in Indigenous communities to support infrastructure that improves basic emergency services, and they are against the broken promises and inaction of the Liberal government on those issues. And if it sounds familiar to some of my colleagues, well, it should. It's on the front page of their website. Yet they stand prepared to support this government to eliminate the right of parliamentarians to question and to hold this government to account on life-threatening issues like the ones identified today by the Auditor General. By supporting the Liberals, the NDP will be condoning their continued spend more, achieve less results for Canadian taxpayers and Indigenous people. In an interview in the last election, when asked if he would support the Liberals in Parliament, the leader of the NDP said, and I quote, "I think it's clear with the evidence. Another 4 years of this Prime Minister will make things worse. He has made things bad, and it is going to get worse. So people can't afford another 4 years of this Prime Minister," end quote. During that same election campaign, the NDP put out an ad that claimed that the Prime Minister talks and the leader of the NDP delivers. That said, I'd like to know exactly what my NDP colleagues are delivering by supporting Motion 22.